Kendeeks here with a thought and a prayer from the daily office, but I'm about a week behind. I want to share with you something that was found in last week's readings for those of you that are reading through the Book of Common Prayer 2019. Last week, one of the readings, I think it was last week, one of the readings was from Deuteronomy chapter 19. We're working our way through Deuteronomy as part of the readings. And there's this fascinating situation laid out in Deuteronomy 19 that basically concerns manslaughter or accidental death. And the text says here, verse 2, you shall set apart 3 cities for yourselves in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. So once they've occupied the land, they are to select 3 cities. They're to be geographically positioned throughout the country. And verse 4 tells us why, what their purpose is. This is the provision for the manslayer, who by fleeing there may save his life, if anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past. So there's no record here of animosity or conflict. It truly appears to be an accident. And verse 5 gives us a specific example. As when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies, he may flee to one of these cities and live, lest the avenger, blood and hot anger, pursue the manslayer and overtake him. So it's kind of a Wild West situation here. Someone accidentally kills a member of a family. The family hears about it. They're going to, unless they're kind of righteous people, but the impulse is that they're going to go after whoever caused this, and eye for eye, tooth for tooth sort of thing. The problem is it really is an eye for eye. The principle of eye for eye, tooth for tooth is a very important legal principle. It sounds barbaric, but it's really not. It's the principle of equal measure, or to say it another way, the punishment must fit the crime. If you take out one of my eyes, my impulse is to take out both of your eyes. So the principle eye for eye, tooth for tooth is the principle of equal measure. The crime, the punishment must fit the crime. So here, if someone kills someone accidentally, they really shouldn't be put to death. Their culpability, if there is any, or their bearing of any burden or cost for this should be less than death, because otherwise the punishment or the consequences really wouldn't fit the crime. And so we're told in verse 11 that they're to flee to one of these cities. Now, these cities, there's 3 of them. Provision is made in this chapter for 3 more, should that be necessary, for a total of 6. These cities would have been administered by the Levites. You remember the Levites of the tribe of Levi? They're given no land of their own, but there are these designated towns where the Levites could live, and they were given provision. If we read some of the other chapters on the Levites' provision for the Levites, they were given provision to kind of garden. Farm is probably not the right term, because they're not given enough land to really be farmers, but enough land to kind of garden for themselves. And the land was to go out 1,000 feet from the city wall, and then another 2,000 feet the other direction. That was a patch of land outside the city walls that the Levites could grow food, presumably for their own families. Of course, they also received some income from the temple when they went to the temple and did their service. They would receive portions of the sacrifices, of some of the meat and the animals and so on. So this was the way the Levites took were really taken care of. Numbers 18 says this, where the Lord says to Aaron, "You shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel." So when the land is carved up amongst the tribes, the Levites aren't given land of their own. So they have certain designated cities where the Levites will dwell, and these 3 cities of refuge are 3 of them. And as well as being priests, they also function as kinds of judges. And so presumably the person would flee to the city of refuge, and it's not, hide and seek. There would be a due process that would take place. The Levites would undertake to hear the case. Presumably witnesses would be called. The offended family could provide witnesses, and so on and so forth. And if as Deuteronomy says here, if anyone hates his neighbor, this is verse 11, and lies in wait for him and attacks him and strikes him fatally so that he dies, and he flees to one of these cities, then the elders of that city shall send and take him away from there and hand him over. Pardon me, he says the elders of his city. So the elders of the city of refuge would decide the case. And if the person was guilty of deliberate murder, maybe they tried to make it look like an accident, but they're really guilty of deliberate murder, they would then hand over that person out of the city of refuge. They have no right to the city of refuge. Hand them over to the elders of their home city, and then they would be taken care of with the maximum penalty, which would have been execution. Now, there's a part of this chapter that makes me kind of feel like the punchline is missing, because we're told what happens to the person who doesn't belong in the city of refuge, but what about the one who does? What happens to them? I kind of feel like someone's told me a joke and then they haven't told me the end part. What's the punchline? What happens to the person that flees to the city of refuge? Well, we can tell from some other texts in the Old Testament some of the provisions, and one of them was that he would dwell in the city of refuge, and his sentence, as it were, would be until the high priest dies. So if you went to the city of refuge, you kind of hope that, the high priest was pretty old. Now, but some period of time would be required in the city of refuge, possibly for punishment. That might not be the right word, because you might not be guilty, but nevertheless, you have to take some responsibility for what happened. If the axe head flew off your axe, that's a reminder, hey, always check your equipment, make sure it's in good shape. But it's also partly for the protection of that person, because if they're left, free to go back to their hometown too early to the incident, they could still fall victim to some kind of revenge. So when you read a chapter like this, there's part of the Western mind, the modern Western mind, that says, that is a really weird way to administer justice. But you can't compare what's happening here to what happens now, as if, we're any better at administering justice. But you need to compare what's happening here with what was happening before. A real vigilante culture where everybody kind of meted out justice and more. And so the law of God, the Torah of God, is introducing principles of law that are still at work today in our culture, in our society. Principles like due process, principles like the punishment must fit the crime. So there's great value in these Old Testament passages, these obscure chapters, even in places like the book of Deuteronomy. Wonderful insights for living, that are still impacting us in positive ways today. Until next time, the Lord be with you.